Star Trek: The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Worf's First Adventure, Chapter 7. A few weeks later, Worf walked across the cafeteria, carrying the tray with his lunch on it. A special replicator program had been created to simulate Klingon foods. The flavor wasn't exactly right, though, and Worf was not especially thrilled with the results. It was a sentiment shared by his fellow cadets. They'd long gotten past their initial revulsion whenever Worf happened to get near with his lunch. But he wasn't exactly a welcome lunch companion. Rarely did anyone ever stand up and wave and shout, "Worf, bring your plate of nauseating, worm-like crawling things over here." "Burp," said Worf. For a while there, Cadet Stanislav was trying to lose weight, so he made a point of eating every meal as near to Worf as he could. Looking at Worf's food always killed Stanislav's appetite, and in no time at all, he had dropped 15 pounds. Once he'd reached his goal weight, however, he went back to eating near cadets with less repulsive lunches. So Worf usually wound up eating with Simon, who was at least accustomed to the Klingons' eating habits. He put his tray down opposite his brother's. "How are you?" he asked, without really looking at Simon, but when he did, he blinked in surprise. Simon was asleep. Clearly, he had merely intended to rest his eyes for a moment. He sat with his head propped up on his fist, but now there he was, softly snoring. "Simon," whispered Worf harshly, and he prodded his brother. Simon jumped slightly, his eyes snapping open, and he looked around a moment in confusion. "Huh?" "Simon, what is the matter with you?" "Oh." He rubbed his eyes with his fists, trying his best to shake the sleep out of them. "Just put in a late night, that's all." Worf looked at him askance. "Late night? The study group broke up at 2300 hours. How much later did you stay up past then?" Another 3-4 hours. "Why?" There were some things I didn't get, okay? Some warp sign ratios that were a bit hard to follow, that's all." Worf was dumbfounded. "I thought we all were clear on that. You did not give any indication that—" "I didn't want to slow everyone down, okay? I have it now. I'm clear on it. There's nothing more that has to be said about it, all right?" It was all very strange to Worf. The warp sign ratios were basic stuff. Worf was no genius when it came to such things, but even he had gotten a handle on it very quickly. And then he realized that it was just Simon being Simon. Simple understanding was never good enough for him. Surely Simon had grasped the fundamentals immediately. Knowing him, what he was busy doing now was working ahead, trying to stay one jump in front of the students and possibly even the teacher. Yes, that would be typical behavior for him. While the others were getting the basics straight, Simon was light years ahead learning the advanced stuff. In fact, he was probably doing it so that when Worf hit a snag, as would inevitably happen, Simon would already be thoroughly versed in the material so that he could help Worf along. Because that was the sort of considerate brother that Simon was. "All right, Simon," said Worf gamely, not wanting to indicate to Simon that he'd figured out what he was up to. "All right." Mark McHenry dropped into place next to him, his tray rattling loudly as he sat down. He looked at Simon and Worf intently. "Why isn't there a word that rhymes with orange?" he asked. The Rozhenko brothers stared at each other, and then an upperclassman called out loudly, "Cadets!" It was a tone of voice that they recognized immediately. They leapt to their feet, snapping to full attention. Superintendent Sulak entered and strode to the front of the cafeteria. The cadets remained on their feet, looking neither left nor right. Sulak reached the front and turned to face them. "As you were," said the imposing, deep-voiced Vulcan. The cadets immediately took their seats and remained motionless, waiting patiently for Sulak to speak. "Professor Lupisky," he said, "has been in an air vehicle accident. Fortunately, it was not fatal, but the professor will be out of commission for the rest of the week. We have his combat strategy class next period, Worf said in a low voice to Simon. I guess you don't, McHenry replied equally softly. Quiet, please, said Sulak, prompting Worf to wince in chagrin at having forgotten the sharpness of Vulcan ears. Now then, far be it from Professor Lupinski to give all of you a week off. Therefore, in place of his class time, and in fact during your spare time, each of you is to prepare a paper on the following topic. 2 years ago, Captain Jean-Luc Picard, while in command of the USS Stargazer, was ambushed in the Maxia Zeta star system. He improvised a combat technique which has been nicknamed the Picard maneuver. This unprecedented procedure resulted in the survival of his crew, although it did result in the loss of the vessel itself. Your assignment is to select 20 significant battles in Starfleet history, then suggest how they might have ended differently had the Picard maneuver been in existence at the time. That is all. Without another word, Sulak turned and walked out of the cafeteria. The moment Sulak was gone, the cadets started murmuring to each other, discussing which battles they might write about. Mind if I join you? Simon and Worf looked up and saw Tanya standing there holding a tray. Simon slid aside as Tanya seated herself. I heard my father talking about that whole Stargazer business, said Simon. Picard was court-martialed, I heard. I am not surprised, said Worf. Our captain should go down with his ship. I could never serve under such a man. Worf, did it ever occur to you that you might not be given a choice of who you serve under? Said Tanya with a smile. Besides, as I recall, the court-martial didn't result in a conviction, so obviously Starfleet felt that his actions were not out of line. Well, said Worf stiffly, there are many variables that go into a court-martial. Who knows what sort of tactics the defense lawyer used? Oh, yes, said Tanya. Maybe the lawyer did something underhanded like, having testimony from the crew members who owed their life to Picard's ingenuity. Worf made a dismissive noise. It is pointless to discuss it. The entire matter is moot. She shrugged. Okay. Do you want to work on our projects together? She was looking at him with those large doe eyes of hers. Worf merely replied, Perhaps. We can discuss it later. If you will excuse me. He rose and started out of the room. Simon turned to Tanya and said, Be right back, and then headed after his brother. Worf, he said in a whisper, drawing alongside him. Does someone have to hit you over the head with a rock or something? Worf looked at him in confusion. I hope not. Why? Tanya, Worf. The way she looks at you. The way her voice gets softer whenever she talks to you. Worf frowned. I do not understand. She's crazy about you, Worf. You spend so much time scowling that you're totally missing what's happening in the world around you. Nonsense, said Worf firmly. She has no particular feeling for me. Yes, she does. And even if she did, she is human. I am Klingon. You're a Klingon raised by humans. If she's interested in you, you should pursue it. He took Simon firmly by the shoulders. Simon, at most I would be an object of curiosity for her. That is all. I will not be what is the phrase? A guinea pig for her to experiment on. If she is feeling inquisitive, let her inquire elsewhere. Before Simon could say another word, Worf turned and walked out of the cafeteria. Chapter 8. Commander Clark was one of the foremost experts in hand-to-hand combat in all of Starfleet. He walked with a confidence and swagger that Worf could not help but admire. The cadets were dressed in loose-fitting workout uniforms. They were seated in a circle on the floor, their legs crisscrossed in the lotus position. Clark walked around the circle, his hands draped loosely behind his back. He was broad-shouldered, muscular. His hair was gray and cropped to reveal a widow's peak. His hands looked like slabs of meat, and the muscles on his legs appeared finely carved like marble. Worf watched him carefully, making mental notes of his every move. Seated across from Worf in the circle was Zach Keeburn. Worf tried not to look at him, bad enough they had to stare at him all the time in their shared quarters. "Thus far," Clark was saying, "we have been training in unarmed combat. You cannot allow yourselves to become dependent simply on phasers, particularly those of you who are intending to specialize in security duty. You must be able to disarm and handle opponents without automatically resorting to shooting them. Are we all clear on that?" There were nods from around the circle. "We've been focusing on the basics of Taekwondo for offense, since its reliance on the use of legs gives you an extended reach. And we've been using Aikido to build a defense system, since Aikido is tremendously effective in turning your opponent's strength aside. There are many types of life forms out in the galaxy, many of them with strength far higher than Terran norm." Zach nodded in approval at the words. Worf said nothing but merely humphed mentally. "There are also," said Clark, "many weapons which you must be versed in. You never know when you're going to be drawn into a personal combat situation, and there may even be times when such combat is ritualistic and obligatory in the society you're visiting at the time. The Prime Directive instructs us to obey local customs whenever possible. Duels and such are not something you'll run into every day, but they are possibilities that you must be prepared for. This aspect of the self-defense course was once introduced by Admiral James T. Kirk himself during his tenure teaching at the Academy. In his voyages, he had to handle a variety of weapons. Fortunately, the Admiral was a very quick study, and that saved his life, but he, and we, believe in being prepared." Clark walked over to his supply closet and pulled out 2 long staffs, simple wooden staffs, but nevertheless they looked potentially vicious. A number of weapons throughout the galaxy are variations on the ancient Terran weapon called the quarterstaff. The Vulcans, for example, have the Lirpa, which has the rather intriguing additions of a bludgeon at one end and a fairly vicious blade on the other. The Pomanians have the Saisk, which has shredded sheets of cloth at either end. That may sound absurd until you realize that they're very effective for momentarily blocking your vision, and in personal combat, losing sight of your foe for even a moment can result in a very quick end to the combat. And, if you're unlucky, to you. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Worf looking as if he had something to say. "Yes, Mr. Worf?" Worf was thinking of the batleth, the bladed Klingon weapon that was also very similar to the quarterstaff. It was, in fact, a weapon that he was rather experienced with. It was one of the few possessions that had been salvaged from Khitomer. It had belonged to his father, his Klingon father Moog, and Worf had practiced with it zealously every day of his life. At first, Helena Rozhenko had been terrified of the weapon, particularly the vicious hissing noise it made as a blade cut through the air. She began accidentally misplacing it, but Worf would always find it within a day or so. Finally, in exasperation, she had said, "Fine, but if you cut off a leg, don't come running to me." Young Worf hadn't even bothered to point out the contradiction in that. He was too busy practicing. Nevertheless, he abruptly felt self-conscious. If he described his own experience, he would draw attention to the notion that he himself was a member of one of those alien races with bizarre weapons that they were preparing for. "Just shifting position, sir," said Worf slowly. "I see." Clark turned his attention back to the class. "If you understand the basics of how to use the quarterstaff, it will serve you well should you find yourself in a situation where you have to use similar weapons." He held a quarterstaff out in front of him horizontally. "You place your hands here and here," he said, indicating places near the midpoint of the staff. "Don't grip it tightly. Now, to bring up one of the ends, you keep one hand stationary and slide the other hand inward like so." In about 15 minutes, Clark had outlined the fundamental quarterstaff moves. Then he surveyed the ring of students. Mr. Worf, you'll be my first victim. I hope you've shifted position enough to keep you limber. Worf rose and took a place within the circle. The other cadets backed up slightly to provide more room. He picked up the other quarterstaff and, balancing it confidently in his hands, poised on the balls of his bare feet and faced Clark. Clark came in fast, feinting. Worf made a small motion as if he believed that the feint was in fact the real move. So when Clark brought the end of his staff around with his genuine attack, Worf had not committed himself and was able to sidestep with ease. Clark, who had been overconfident, missed clean. He was momentarily off balance, and Worf brought the staff up fast and slammed it against the pit of Clark's stomach. Clark made a whoop noise and went down to his knees, gasping. The entire exchange had taken no more than 5 seconds. It took almost that long again for the students to register what had happened. Automatically, the other cadets started forward to help him, but Clark managed to wave them off. "Worf, help him up," said Cadet Briggs. Worf stared at him in mild surprise. Helping Clark up had never occurred to him. If a warrior was felled, it was considered dishonorable to extend a hand to him. The implication would be that the fallen warrior was weak and unable to fend for himself. The honorable thing to do, as long as it wasn't a life and death situation, was to stand perfectly still, to wait for the downed opponent to compose himself and state whether he wished to continue. "Why?" asked Worf. "Because it's the right thing to do," said another cadet angrily. "What, Klingons don't help each other up?" "No," he said matter-of-factly. He looked around slowly and, instead of admiration, saw the look of barely restrained contempt in their faces. They hated him. They all hated him. Clark, who had managed to recover his voice, finally said, "It's okay. I'm fine, Mr. Worf," he said grudgingly. "It seems I've allowed myself to get sloppy, and you didn't let me get away with it. Good for you." He slowly straightened up. "Thank you, sir." Then Clark noticed that Zach Keeburn was scowling fiercely, more fiercely than ever before, which was something of an accomplishment. "Mr. Keeburn, you think you can do better against Mr. Worf?" "Yes," was all he said. Clark waved for him to get up, and Zach did so. The instructor handed him the quarterstaff, and then Clark sat down off to the side, nursing his bruised stomach. Zach Keeburn held the staff with confidence and faced Worf. "This time," he said, "you're going to get hurt." "If you're able," Worf replied indifferently. Clark looked up, suddenly remembering. He hadn't been present that first day of the school year when Worf and Zach had gotten into a fistfight. There was genuine bad blood between the two of them, but he'd only heard about it secondhand, and that was a few weeks ago, so it wasn't fresh in Clark's mind, especially when he'd just gotten his teeth rattled by the Klingon staff. Having the Klingon in the Brickar battle now with weapons was an extraordinarily bad move. Clark immediately started to shout for them to stop. It was too late. The weapons slammed together. The cadets immediately began shouting encouragement in voices so loud and raucous that the still breathless Clark couldn't make himself heard. The first exchange of blows was so rapid that no one except the two combatants could follow it. The air was alive with the rapid clack-clack of the wood on wood. For the first moments of the encounter, Worf calmly sized up the tactics of his opponent. Zach seemed to be depending on his size and strength to carry the day. Zach pressed the attack, and Worf allowed himself to be driven back. Then Worf ducked under one particularly fierce blow and brought his staff up quickly, slamming Zach in the stomach. The Brickar staggered only slightly and recovered much faster than Worf had anticipated. He charged forward, and Worf was barely able to block the thrust. They stood there a moment, shoving and grunting, pushing against each other, neither giving ground. The cadets were cheering and shouting, but no one was calling out Worf's name. If the lack of support bothered him, he didn't let it show. Worf twisted, and Zach's staff slid off, momentarily unbalancing him. Worf chose that moment to try and end it. He reversed his quarterstaff and slammed it down. But Zach deflected Worf's quarterstaff and, in that moment, switched tactics and drove a furious kick to Worf's stomach. Worf had a split second to react to it, and he managed to twist himself around and catch some of the impact with his sturdy rib cage. He spun with the force of the blow and dropped to one knee. As Zach's quarterstaff whistled above his head, cutting an arc in the air, Worf jammed his quarterstaff in between Zach's legs. Before Zach realized what was happening, Worf pulled back on the quarterstaff, using it as a lever. It sent Zach's feet right out from under him, and he thudded to the floor with such a powerful crash that it seemed to shake the gymnasium. Like a bolt of lightning, Worf was straddling him, his quarterstaff across Zach's throat and pushing down. "Surrender!" grated Worf. Zach said nothing. He glowered fiercely at Worf and tried to push him off, but he couldn't get the leverage to do it. "That's enough, Mr. Worf," Clark now said. "Get off him now." Slowly, Worf stepped back. Zach got to his feet, refusing to show any sign of weakness, such as rubbing any bruised parts of his body. "Shake hands," said Clark. They looked at him. "Now," Clark said with no undue emphasis, and added, "That was not a request, gentlemen." The two of them shook hands, but Worf could see from the way that Zach was looking at him that he was filled with anger and hostility. And he could also see from the way that the other students were staring at him that he didn't have a lot of hope for winning a popularity contest in the near future. "Put the quarterstaffs back, gentlemen," said Clark. He clapped his hands briskly, and Worf and Zach replaced the staffs in the closet. For the rest of the period, Zach said nothing to Worf, nor did anyone else.